For the man who killed John Lennon, Mark David Chapman shot Lennon in the back 4 times in December of 1980. He was sentenced to 20 years to life after pleading guilty.
John Lennon, a musical maestro and tireless advocate for peace, left an indelible mark on the world. Beyond the melodies and messages of hope, his life took a dark turn on that fateful day. In this gripping exploration, we plunge into the enigma surrounding Lennon's untimely demise. What forces, what intricate threads wove together to bring down such an iconic figure? Join us as we unravel the perplexing fabric of events, influences, and tensions that led to the shocking and unthinkable, as you can't imagine why they killed John Lennon. Lennon's early musical exploration. When John Lennon was just 15, he started a band called the Quarrymen, named after his school. This happened in September 1956. Within 6 months, the band was playing a lively mix of songs, half skiffle and half rock and roll. Skiffle is a type of folk music that's a blend of blues, jazz, and American folk, often played with homemade instruments. In the summer of 1957, John and his crew performed at St. Peter's Church Garden Fete. John played the guitar and sang. Eric Griffiths was the second guitarist. Colin Hanton played the drums. Rod Davis played the banjo, Pete Shotton used a washboard, and Len Gary played a homemade bass. Legend has it that the bass was made from a tea chest. First, they played in the back of a moving truck following the Cheshire Yeomanry Band, and later they were supposed to perform on stage. This was only the second time the Quarrymen performed at Woolton, where John met Paul McCartney. They soon became a strong creative duo in the group, and for a long time they signed their music as Lennon-McCartney. Even years later, their songwriting partnership is seen as one of the most influential and successful of the 20th century. But hold on, let's not rush. Paul was impressed with John because he was a bit older and seemed not to care about anything. He had this rebellious vibe and smelled like beer. The guys got to know each other, and McCartney showed Lennon a stunning performance with songs by Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent, and a mix of Little Richard tunes. This happened before the evening show. After the gig, John chatted with friends and thought it would be interesting to invite Paul to join the group. Len Gary remembers, "I remember Paul coming along that night at St. Peter's Church Hall, picking up a guitar. I didn't even know he was left-handed and playing a couple of chords. I think he was trying to audition for us." 2 weeks later, Shotton ran into McCartney cycling through Woolton and passed along Lennon's invitation to join the Quarrymen. Soon, McCartney made his debut with the group at a party at the Conservative Club. Around that time, Shotton and Davis left the band as it shifted more towards rock from skiffle. Meanwhile, Paul's dad wasn't thrilled about John, thinking Lennon would lead his son into trouble. However, he let the young band rehearse in their living room. During those rehearsals, John wrote his first song, "Hello Little Girl," which would later become a top 10 hit in the UK for The Foremost in 1963. John Lennon found friends who helped him deal with difficulties, discover himself, and kickstart his musical journey. The early Quarrymen concerts turned out to be unexpectedly significant for John and the gang. The global impact of John Lennon's music. John Lennon, first with the Beatles and later on his own, created a rich musical fabric that went beyond borders and cultures. His songs became anthems of an era, reflecting changes in society, hopes, fears, and dreams. From the streets of Liverpool to far corners of the world, his music struck a deep chord. It wasn't just a sound wave, it sparked a cultural revolution. In the early days with the Beatles, Lennon's music captured the excitement of the swinging 60s. Songs like "She Loves You" and "I Want to Hold Your Hand" had lively, catchy tunes that echoed the optimism of the time. But it wasn't just the upbeat music. It was the universal themes of love, joy, heartbreak, and hope that everyone, no matter where they came from, could understand and connect with. As the Beatles evolved, so did Lennon's songwriting. It became more sophisticated and introspective. While his early works fueled Beatlemania, his later compositions delved into deeper, more reflective stories. "In My Life," for instance, is a thoughtful look at the passing of time. On the other hand, "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" explores whimsical and almost surreal realms. These songs, among many others, showcased Lennon's ability to capture the spirit of the times, expressing the silent thoughts and vivid imaginations of a generation. Lennon's music played a crucial role in bridging gaps, bringing people together through shared emotions and experiences. During the Cold War, even though the Soviet Union mostly banned Beatles records, bootleg copies somehow reached the hands of young people. This brought a taste of the Western world and the idea of freedom. It wasn't just about the music, it was about the values it represented. Behind the Iron Curtain, Lennon's music became connected with liberty, dissent, and the hope for a better future. Beyond the Beatles, Lennon's solo career went deeper into social and political issues. One of his most famous solo tracks, Imagine, paints a picture of a world without borders, religions, or possessions, where people live together peacefully. It became more than just a song. It turned into a peace anthem, a call for unity in a world filled with conflict and division. That's how powerful Lennon's music was. It could make people stop and rethink their views, dreaming of a world where love rules. Yet Lennon wasn't just about utopian dreams. He was well aware of the struggles of his time. Songs like Working Class Hero addressed social inequalities and the disappointment felt by the lower classes. With stark honesty, he wasn't afraid to criticize, make people think, or challenge the status quo. This bold spirit in his music made him more than just a musician. He became a social commentator, a voice for those who didn't have one, Lennon's outspoken political view. John Lennon never hesitated to share his thoughts, especially about politics. His journey from the Beatles' early days to his solo years showed a shift from a pop star to a passionate supporter of peace, civil rights, and social change. This change endeared him to many, but also made him a controversial figure, often clashing with establishments and sparking debates. The late 1960s were a tumultuous time with the Vietnam War, civil rights movements, and a global call for peace. Lennon, deeply impacted by these events, started using his platform to speak out against war and violence. His and Yoko Ono's famous bed-ins for peace in Amsterdam and Montreal were avant-garde protests against the Vietnam War. They cleverly invited the press into their honeymoon suite, using their celebrity status to focus the world's attention on the message of peace. Their goal was clear: to promote nonviolence and question the need for war. The song Give Peace a Chance, recorded during the Montreal bed-in, became an anti-war anthem, resonating with millions disillusioned by the prolonged conflict in Vietnam. Its straightforward message and catchy chorus turned it into a rallying cry for peace demonstrations worldwide. Lennon's involvement in politics wasn't limited to the anti-war movement. After moving to New York in the early 1970s, he became deeply engaged in the civil rights movement. His song Woman is the Nigger of the World stirred controversy with its provocative title, but it also sheds light on the struggles of oppressed women globally, drawing parallels with racial discrimination and advocating for gender and racial equality. Lennon showed he cared about fairness in society and understood how different issues were connected. He hung out with famous activists like Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman, which made him even more noticeable in the political scene. While this made him look like a strong activist, it also got the attention of the US government. He openly criticized the Nixon administration and got noticed for possibly influencing young people. This made the FBI interested in him. Lennon's habit of speaking his mind also got him into arguments with the British government. When he gave back his MBE medal in 1969, it was a clear way of saying he disagreed with the UK being involved in global conflicts and supporting the US in the Vietnam War. This wasn't just him making a personal statement, it was like a symbol showing his strong disapproval. Lennon also used his music to talk about what was going on in British society. Working Class Hero is a song where he criticizes the class system and how society is set up, saying it keeps inequality going. In the song, he talks about how many working class people feel left out and how the system doesn't seem to give them a fair chance to move up. His influence on the peace movement. John Lennon didn't just stick to being a famous pop star. He became a big voice in the global peace movement of the 1960s and 70s. While other artists talked about what was happening in the world, Lennon did more than just talk. He actively joined in. using his fame to support things like nonviolence, understanding, and unity. When we talk about Lennon's impact on the peace movement, we can't skip over the famous song, Imagine. Its words painted a picture of a world without borders, like countries, religions, or things we own. The idea of everyone living together peacefully in a united world connected with a lot of people. Imagine wasn't just a song, it was like a worldwide call to action. It asked humanity to rise above our differences and come together, and you can still hear it being sung at peace rallies, even many years after it first came out. Lennon didn't just talk about peace, he did things that showed he was committed. His and Yoko Ono's bed-ins for peace were like masterclasses in different ways to protest. By inviting the world into their honeymoon suite, they made a big show that the media couldn't ignore. Instead of the usual celebrity stories, reporters found a couple talking about peace. It turned a personal event into a political message. This unique way of peacefully protesting showed Lennon's belief in nonviolent resistance and how he could use the media's attention for a good cause. The peace movement wasn't just about stopping wars for Lennon. It was about changing the things in society that caused conflicts. In songs like Revolution, he questioned violent uprisings, saying real change comes from a shift in how we think, not from fighting. Even though Lennon knew society needed a big change, he always said we should do it peacefully. His message wasn't just for people in the West. It went way beyond that. Lennon talked about peace and spoke against war in a way that went across cultures and countries. This was especially important for people in places where there was a lot of fighting. Lennon's songs became like a symbol of hope. He believed that love and understanding were powerful and could be an alternative to all the talk of hate and division that you often hear in global politics. Lennon didn't only influence the people who listened to his music, he also had an impact on other musicians and artists. His strong commitment to peace encouraged others to use their fame to speak up for important causes. Things like the Concert for Bangladesh, which he indirectly inspired, showed how artists could come together for a good reason. Lennon proved that when you mix music with activism, you can make a difference. It got fans and regular people interested in important global problems. The FBI's interest in Lennon. In the early 1970s, John Lennon's connection with the United States was like a mix of music, politics, and mystery. Lennon was pretty vocal about his disapproval of the Vietnam War and had ties with left-wing figures, which grabbed the attention of the US government. The FBI, especially, was keeping a close eye on him. Now, this FBI interest didn't just pop out of nowhere. When Lennon moved to New York City in 1971, the US was deep into the Vietnam War mess. People all over were protesting, and the Nixon administration wanted to hush up or keep an eye on anyone who criticized the war. Lennon, with his huge popularity and track record of speaking out against the war, naturally became a target. Adding to the suspicion were Lennon's pals, Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman, who were known for their radical ideas and protests. Lennon's involvement in events like the Free John Sinclair rally in 1971, where he advocated for releasing an anti-war activist, showed he was serious about challenging the powers that be. Because of all these connections and activities, the FBI didn't just gather public statements or song lyrics, they went all out. They had agents following Lennon around, listening in on his phone calls and reporting on what he did every day. It was like they were making a detailed file on him. The reports watching Lennon didn't just focus on big political stuff. They covered everything from his important meetings to his everyday life. The FBI didn't just gather this info for fun, they used it in a plan to kick Lennon out of the US. In 1972, Lennon had a tough fight to stay in the country. The Nixon folks wanted him gone, thinking he was causing trouble in an election year. The official reason for wanting to kick him out was an old charge for having marijuana in the UK. But lots of people thought, and later documents confirmed, that it was Lennon's politics that got the government all worked up. The fight to deport Lennon became a big public show. Lennon and his legal team made sure everyone knew the government was going after him because of his political views. People came together to support Lennon, thinking the government was messing with his rights and unfairly targeting him. After a long legal battle, in 1975, Lennon finally got the green light to stay in the US for good. That was the end of this whole messy situation. The controversy surrounding his comments about religion. John Lennon was never one to hold back his opinions, and sometimes that got him into big controversies. One of the biggest was when he said something about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus. This comment caused a massive stir worldwide, sparking anger, debates, and even boycotts. In 1966, during an interview with a journalist named Maureen Cleave, Lennon casually talked about how Christianity seemed to be losing its grip in the modern world. He was saying that young people were more into things like pop culture, and he used the Beatles' popularity as an example. Lennon said, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I do not know what will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. We're more popular than Jesus." But when an American teen magazine quoted this later, they left out the full context. Instead, they focused only on the part where Lennon said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. This caused a huge uproar, especially in the United States. Radio stations stopped playing Beatles music.
This is Tommy Charles. If you, as an American teenager, are offended by statements from a group of foreign singers with
people publicly burned their records, and there were even threats. It wasn't just devout Christians who were upset. Many thought the Beatles, already a super famous band, were being too arrogant. Lennon, known for speaking his mind, was surprised by how strong the reaction was. In a press conference in Chicago, he had to explain that he wasn't saying the band was more important than Jesus. He was just talking about how society was changing with organized religion. This event, even though it got a lot of attention, wasn't the only time Lennon dealt with religion. In his whole career, he'd talk about religious ideas, sometimes respecting them, other times criticizing them. His solo song God is like a diary of his faith journey. In the song, he lists many things he doesn't believe in, ending with, "I just believe in me, Yoko, and me." This deep look into his thoughts about religion shows how Lennon's spiritual views were changing. He was more about his faith than following organized religion. Tensions in the late 60s and early 70s. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a time of big changes all over the world and in John Lennon's life. A lot was happening: wars, political shifts, and cultural revolutions. In the middle of all this, Lennon was going through some major changes too. He went from being part of the Beatles to doing his own thing, from a young guy to a mature voice for activism, and from enjoying private stardom to dealing with public disagreements. The Vietnam War was a huge deal during this time, especially in the Western world. It led to massive anti-war protests in the US and beyond. The counterculture movement, driven by young people who were fed up with old-fashioned values and the system, spoke out against the war. Images of bombings, injured kids, and the growing number of casualties made a lot of people question why the war was happening. Lennon, being a big deal himself, joined in with songs like "Give Peace a Chance," which became anthems for the anti-war crowd. But it wasn't just the war causing issues. Civil rights movements were gaining strength, fighting against racism and demanding equal rights for everyone, no matter their race. Events like the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. showed deep-seated racial tensions in the US. At the same time, the feminist movement was pushing for women's rights, challenging old-fashioned norms, and asking for equal opportunities. In the middle of all these global events, Lennon's personal life was a bit of a mess too. The Beatles, once super tight, started to fall apart. The stunning vision that once brought us awesome music from the Beatles started to go in different directions. They had their dreams, fights about business stuff and personal problems. All of this led to the group breaking up in 1970. For Lennon, it wasn't just the end of a musical era. It was a big change in his personal life, too. At this time, Lennon's connection with Yoko Ono became super important. They weren't just romantically linked. They were a team in everything: music, art, and activism. But not everyone liked this. Some fans and media unfairly blamed Ono for the Beatles splitting up. Their artsy exhibitions and peace protests, like the famous Bed-In, aimed to spread peace, but often got laughed at or doubted. In the music scene, Lennon went through a big transformation. he left the safety of working with the Beatles and started a solo journey that was deep and personal. Albums like John Lennon Plastic Ono Band and Imagine showed how much of an artist he was. His songs dived into themes like love, peace, pain, and his struggles. The music was all about Lennon's battles and how he saw the world, the events leading up to the tragedy. The days just before John Lennon's sad end were a mix of everyday routine, creativity, and glimpses of his ongoing commitment to peace and love. These days capture the heartbreaking irony of his life's tragic end because they were filled with hope, love, and plans for the future. In December 1980, Lennon was in New York City with Yoko Ono and their young son Sean. The Dakota, where they lived, was like a symbol of their life together, a special place for art, music, and family. Lennon had recently come back into the spotlight after taking a break from the music scene. During that break, he focused on being a dad and a husband. This time of thinking and recharging led to a new album called Double Fantasy, a joint effort with Ono. The album showed off their lasting love and partnership and carried the dreams of a bright future. From late November to early December, Lennon was busy with interviews and promoting the new album. In these talks, he seemed relaxed, happy, and optimistic. He spoke openly about his past, the things he had learned, and his hopes for the next decade. Lennon looked like he was in a good place, enjoying being a dad and looking forward to more years of making music and being an activist. During these times, Lennon and Ono were right in the middle of their ongoing mission for peace. New York City, with its busy streets and all kinds of people, was where they worked their magic. They spread messages of love and togetherness, asking everyone to think about a future without war, hate, or division. This vision wasn't just for show. It was a big part of their everyday lives. You could often catch them taking walks in Central Park, talking with fans, and hugging the city that had become their home. Now, it's time for today's subscriber pick. On that chilling night, Mark David Chapman emerged from the shadows of the Dakota building, the culmination of an obsession that festered for years. Raised in a tumultuous household, his early years were marked by feelings of inadequacy and isolation. As he grew older, Chapman grappled with mental health issues and a complex relationship with fame, idolatry, and the concept of hero worship. A product of a society fixated on celebrity culture, Chapman identified strongly with Holden Caulfield's angst and contempt for the perceived phoniness of the world. He even signed his letters as Holden Caulfield, showcasing the depth of his identification with the fictional character who despised the hollowness of adulthood and societal norms. Through this distorted lens, Chapman viewed John Lennon, once an admired messenger of peace and love. However, admiration morphed into a lethal combination of admiration and resentment. Lennon became, in Chapman's eyes, a hypocrite, wealthy, famous, and living in contradiction to the simplicity and peace he once espoused. Chapman's motivation for the heinous act remains shrouded in speculation. Was it triggered by Lennon's famous comment about being more popular than Jesus, perceived as the ultimate hypocrisy?
I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is.
Or was it fueled by Chapman's uncontrollable dark obsessions? You can't imagine why they killed John Lennon, can you? The speculations abound, but none satisfactorily explain why someone would gun down a man who symbolized peace and artistic freedom for an entire generation. The question lingers, echoing the inexplicable darkness that enveloped that fateful night. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Disturbing details about John Lennon's death. On the night of December 8, 1980, John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono were heading home to the Dakota, their apartment in New York. As they approached, a man called out to Lennon. Suddenly there were gunshots, and Lennon fell, covered in blood. The shooter, later identified as 25-year-old Mark David Chapman, stood nearby as Lennon bled. Earlier that day, Chapman was outside Lennon's building with a copy of the Double Fantasy album, hoping for Lennon's autograph. A big Beatles fan and deeply religious, Chapman's opinion changed when he heard Lennon say the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. Chapman admitted to planning to kill Lennon for a few months, driven by a desire for self-glory because Lennon was very famous. Lennon was rushed to the hospital after the shooting, but despite efforts to revive him, he had lost too much blood from the gunshot wounds. He was pronounced dead at just 40 years old. A few hours before the tragic incident, Lennon had been in a recording studio with his wife, Yoko Ono, working on a song. The evening took a devastating turn, leaving a profound impact on music history. In the days before he passed away, Lennon had some talks where he shared about his time with the Beatles, the music he liked, and the new album he made with Ono. One of these talks was with a guy named Dave Sholin on the radio. Lennon even mentioned that he wished he would go before his wife, saying, "If Yoko died, I wouldn't know how to survive. I couldn't carry on." Then the sad news broke and the media announced Lennon was shot and killed at about 11 o'clock last night. A TV producer named Alan Weiss, who was in the hospital after a motorcycle accident, happened to be in the same hospital where Lennon was taken. He overheard the police talking about Lennon and saw a doctor tell Ono that her husband had passed away. Weiss quickly shared this with the news team, and ABC News interrupted Monday Night Football to tell everyone about Lennon's death.
He was shot late this evening in front of his apartment building in New York City. Apparently, he was killed almost immediately. The man who shot John Lennon walked up to the musician.
After that, people all over were mourning the loss of a legend. Around 100,000 individuals held a vigil where Lennon got shot, and 20,000 gathered in his hometown, Liverpool. That night, Mark David Chapman fired several shots, and 4 of them hit John Lennon. The world lost a great musician, and the days that followed were filled with sorrow and remembrance. Dr. David Halloran was working at the hospital that night and tried to help Lennon by giving him a cardiac massage, hoping to make his heart beat again. The bullets didn't directly hit Lennon's heart, but they damaged the vessels around it. Dr. Halloran said, "We weren't getting a pulse back. We weren't getting blood pressure back. We weren't getting pupil response back. He was very much gone." Lennon was declared dead at 11:15 p.m. The medical examiner who did Lennon's autopsy found that 2 bullets went into his shoulder and 2 into his back. Lennon died because of shock and losing a lot of blood, and it happened almost right away. One of the bullets that went into his back went through his chest and left lung before coming out. Another bullet hit his left lung and stayed in his neck. By the time Lennon got to the hospital, he didn't have a pulse. The person who shot Lennon, Mark David Chapman, was charged with second-degree murder and got a sentence of 20 years to life after admitting guilt. As of 2020, he has been denied parole 11 times.
Well, parole is denied once again for the man who killed John Lennon. Mark David Chapman shot Lennon in the back 4 times.
And will likely spend the rest of his life in a high-security prison in New York. The killer, Mark David Chapman. The sad end of John Lennon's life was caused by someone very different from the artist's legacy. Mark David Chapman, the person behind Lennon's assassination, remains a mysterious figure in the world of crime. People still talk about and try to understand why he did what he did. Chapman was born in 1955 in Texas and grew up in a troubled home. His early life was tough, and he often felt left out and struggled with his feelings. As he got older, Chapman became a big fan of the Beatles, just like many others his age. But as time passed, his liking turned into an unhealthy obsession. This was partly because of his growing religious beliefs and how he saw things in books, especially in J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. The main character, Holden Caulfield, and his dislike for fake people struck a chord with Chapman. By the late 1970s, Chapman's mental state took a dark turn. He started feeling a deep anger toward celebrities, especially those he thought were pretending to be something they weren't. Lennon, with his messages of peace and love, while living a rich lifestyle, became the focus of Chapman's growing resentment. In Chapman's messed up view, Lennon represented the phoniness that both he and Caulfield hated. Deciding to target Lennon wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. Chapman carefully planned the whole thing. In October 1980, he even quit his job, signing out as John Lennon. Then he went to New York City, determined to carry out his grim mission. The events of December 8, 1980 are now tragically etched in history. Chapman spent the day outside the Dakota, Lennon's home. He even met Lennon earlier in the day, getting an autograph on a record album, a chilling sign of what was to come in the evening. Later that night, as Lennon returned to his apartment, Chapman approached and fired 5 shots. 4 of them hit Lennon, leading to his untimely death. The aftermath was a mix of shock, sorrow, and a struggle to understand why this happened. When caught, Chapman didn't try to run away. He was found reading The Catcher in the Rye, which he later said explained his actions. During his trial, Chapman claimed that he thought killing Lennon would make him feel more important. Forensic experts and psychologists have tried to understand Chapman's mind. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, his twisted interpretations of literature and real-world events played a big role in what he did. He said he heard voices telling him to kill Lennon and saw himself as some kind of avenger, getting rid of what he thought was a fake person in the world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.